We are very mysterious to each other, men and women. And how are, you guys believe that we are different.
Yeah.
And how are we different? How are men different from women?
Whenever you talk about gender at one level, if you don't talk about it, I think you're really a coward. But on the other hand, the moment you try to define the nature of what it means to be a woman and a man, or the roles even more so, you're a fool. So we're really, shall we say, in between cowardice and foolishness. But there is a fundamental difference that you can say, beyond all the biological differences, a woman has the capacity to grow a relationship in her body. No man has that ability. The ability to actually nurture, care for, and weave a child in her womb. There's something about the nature of relationality that is so at the core of being a woman that though she may be relational in a very different way than a man, or a man from a woman, there will always be that sense that the price of the curse for a woman is that you will have pain in childbirth, and that there will be a desire for your husband, and he will rule over you. All that seems to imply there is agony, and there is loneliness, and there is a byproduct of a loss of relationality that is at the very core of who they are.
I want to talk just real quickly about that word desire, because it's commonly misunderstood in Genesis 3, because some people get the idea that the woman is there romantically desiring her husband and he comes back and puts her down. But it's very clear that the Hebrew word there is specific to the desire to control. So on the one hand, we're dealing again with how God created us, and for, in the case of women, for relationship, but how sin mars that. Also, like he mars work for men.
Well, I think in terms of the character of God, we see in Psalm 62, God says, this we know of you. The psalmist says, this we know of you. You're a God of strength and a God of tenderness. And that interplay of strength and tenderness is maybe one of the simplest theologies, simplest naming of the character of God. Well, we're both meant to be strong. We're both meant to be tender, but I think there is a kind of tenderness that my children, when they were hurt, would always go to my wife for a kind of comfort that they didn't find quite in the same way in me. Now, maybe that's my personal failure, but I think there is something that is more general in terms of a mother's comfort, a mother's compassion, somehow is more inviting to tender care than often what a father provides.
And you know, here's where in marriage we can call each other to become, our wives can call us to become more relational, and we can call our wives, you know, to perhaps go out into the workplace and exercise their gifts.
You know, I think of it less as workplace than the world.
Yeah, right.
So in that sense, it may not be, again, work relationship. So that framework of saying, I'm meant to be a more tender man because my wife's tenderness calls me to see it is far harder for me to cry than it is for her. Yet on the other hand, it's far harder for her to enter into conflict than it is for me. Now that can be different in a marriage. There might be a man who's far closer to tears and a woman who's far better at conflict. But we're both calling one another to that kind of growth and tenderness, growth and strength. I think most of us tend to be stronger in one area than the other.
Can you identify, and I realize this is tough, this is where we get into the grounds where we may become a fool for talking about these kinds of things, but can you say, in the most general terms, what some of the roles of a man are, and what some of the roles of, and obviously biological role to produce a baby is a woman's role. I mean, nobody can dispute that.
Thank God.
But what are some of the other roles that we could safely say, well, this is a man's responsibility, it's his role, it's his innate role, and this is a woman's responsibility, it's her innate role?
I certainly think a man is the head of the family.
And that's a controversial statement. I mean, to say that is a controversial statement, and yet you would say that if a man doesn't see himself as the head of his family, there is damage done to the family.
Absolutely. I don't know what to do with Scripture if you don't say that. Now the question is, what does that mean? From my standpoint, it means he's to die first. Whenever there's a core problem in a marriage or a family, you go to the one who's most responsible, not the blame. It's not the blame issue. It is who's most able to begin that process of addressing it, which means a man is meant to die first. And in that dying, to own his own failure, to own his own need, to ask, in one sense, for help. So a man leads by a commitment to enter the war by dying first.
And of course, Genesis 3, the story of the fall, is an example of a man failing horribly in that context. Adam's silence in the garden as he's sitting there with Eve. When it was his turn to take a bite, he didn't ask any questions and he just took a bite.
So in one sense, silence, cowardly silence, the refusal to engage whatever is before. I mean, there are times where, as an academic, my world is books. And so there have been times where my wife, with problems with one of our children or some issue in our life, will look at me and just say, please don't retreat to your books. Stay with me, stay in this. And I can feel inside, I've got a project I've got to finish, I've got some other issue. All I want to do is go to my library where my world works. And she's asking me to step into a chaotic world where it's almost guaranteed I'm going to die. And I don't want to lead. I want her to lead, or I want a book to lead. I want this series to lead. I don't want to have to lead.
Right.
Well, but leading means plunge into the pool first and see if indeed rescue can occur.
If men are to lead, is there a counter problem that could be created where the person who isn't leading would become codependent, literally looking for a rescuer, somebody to make everything okay, and so I'm just going to play the victim? And it feels like part of the men's role, like if Adam were to step into that situation, it would be to say, hey, what are you thinking?
Right.
What are you doing? This is not...
Or get out of here, serpent.
Yeah.
But if the notion is lead, follow, then it's a misunderstanding of leading.
Yeah.
And then what does it look like then to lead if there's no follower?
Well, the word for a woman is the helper. And the whole notion of being the helpmate means...
Well, it doesn't mean, let's say first, it doesn't mean being a valet, picking up after a person. What it means, it's a word that's used for God in the book of Psalms, that Yahweh is Israel's helper. So it's a word that I think is best understood as ally, somebody who is a partner in the conflict. And so it's not a matter, when we talk about headship, we certainly shouldn't have business models in mind when we're talking about it. You pointed that out, and that's awfully correct, but it's interesting how often we forget that.
So the notion of helper is that God is the rescuer. The word seems to come up in context of God keeping Israel from being destroyed by its enemies. So there's a phenomenal warfare motif with that word helper. And so she is, even if this is a dangerous word, she is a rescuer.
They are saving each other's lives.
Absolutely. But her title is helper. So there's a uniqueness. If he's leading, she's helping. It's not leading, and so I need some assistance to accomplish this. She has a window on the world of relationships that enable her to bring, in many ways, warfare in and for and against things that would destroy the relational world that God has built for us. So that call of relationship, she will have a mind for children, a mind for the marriage, a mind for intimacy that's not so much chronic, but constantly thinking in terms of what intimacy could look like. Therefore, her disappointment, more often than not, is greater relationally than it would be for a man. She'll have more pain, and that pain seems to be something that scares her enough to want to tune herself down so that her loneliness doesn't overwhelm the man that she's in relationship with. So if a man is basically going, because of the fall, I've got a world of thorns and thistles, and it's hellish to deal with the blood and the sweat I bring into this world every day, he's basically saying, I'm not enough. And the woman's basically saying, I'm too much. And there you've got the core conflict always between any man and woman. That's what a marriage is meant to address.
In terms of practical, advice, I mean, you guys have counseled hundreds, maybe thousands of couples. What is a consistent characteristic that you see in men that destroys marriages?
Lack of intentionality.
Passiveness.
Passiveness, probably more than any one thing. Come home, open up a beer, sit in front of the tube, read email, and then just let the evening slide away. Hey, what do you want to do? It sounds gracious. What would you like to do? Well, so many wives are basically saying, I don't care what we do, just you decide and create on my behalf. I mean, when Adam first encounters Eve, he literally springs into poetry. He creates. So I think that failure to create goodness on behalf of one's spouse is probably the greatest failure I see as a therapist with men.
Consistently, what do you see in women that you say, consistently you see this destroys marriages, this characteristic?
What I find is a failure to utilize the voice that God gave them in the midst of conflict, where they may settle for peace, but really peace without real honor. So that ability to use one's voice for good for the other is often where either a woman fails to have a voice or her voice becomes cacophonous. It becomes cruel rather than an invitation to redemption.
What is, spiritually, what do you see in biblically, what does a faithful man look like in Scripture?
A faithful man is, as Dan has earlier described, somebody who will step into the battle. I think of Psalm 45, where you have this wedding psalm, and it's describing both the woman and the man. And the man is somebody who bears the sword and will go in and fight on behalf of his family as well as on behalf of his society, his community.
Mm-hmm. I love the work of John and Stacey Eldridge and the notion of captivating. There's a kind of captivating beauty. It's not that a woman is just sort of dressed well and sits there and her beauty draws. A woman is going to war as well, but she goes with a aesthetic, a sense of the beauty of God as she engages. And so as a woman and a man interplay in Psalm 45, you see the woman as beautiful. And the man is courageous. And as the two interplay, you see that the woman actually is immensely courageous, and the man is actually seen to be handsome or beautiful. It is that interplay. Right. We draw each other into what we don't be or have, and then become what the other is. And now we begin not merger, but a calling forth to that which is greater.
But of course, we can't just look at one biblical text and alone. That gives us good insight. But if we only looked at that, we might miss some things that, say, Proverbs 31 points out about a woman. She's not just sitting there looking beautiful. And then you look at Psalm 112. Psalm 112 is very interesting because it has a lot of similarities to Proverbs 31, except it's talking about the virtuous man. And a lot of the traits are similar there. But the most important one, the basic one, the most important thing about both men and women is that they fear God.
Mm-hmm. What is something that you guys do as married men, once a day, once a week? What do you do to keep your marriage alive?
Well, I can tell you that the most important thing that my wife Alice and I do every day to keep our marriage alive is to walk every morning. We take a 1 to 2 mile walk with the dog, so it has a practical purpose as well. Of course, I'm saying this being an empty nester. Most couples with children can't just get up and take a little walk together in the morning like this. But the point is to find a time each day to talk, either at the beginning of the day about what the day will bring, and here the role of imagination comes in, or at the end of the day, preferably both, talking about what happened during the day while we were apart. And in that time, in the last 5 minutes of our walk together, we pray together after we've talked about what the day is going to bring. Now, I travel a lot. We don't do that every day, but when I'm in town or she's in town, then we do that. That's the most important thing that we do.
I would imagine sometimes that's work for you.
Oh,
sometimes
yeah.
you don't want to do it, and yet you'd probably miss it.
Exactly.
When you don't get it.
When it becomes work is when my work becomes an idol. when I want to get to the office because I have so much to do. And if I don't do it, I'm going to not meet this deadline. And so in that sense, it's a kind of sacrifice. It's a sacrifice of kind of a selfish thing, but it's still a sacrifice. And yeah, sometimes it seems like work, especially waking up, really early to do this.
I would say ditto. We have a walk that's about 3 miles, and we do that 3 or 4 times a week. And that becomes the place of clearing, where we just have a chance to hear what the day-to-day, week-to-week, moment-by-moment portions of our life are about. So much of marriage is just sort of like hanging out together. Mm-hmm. There aren't these meaningful, deep, rich conversations sometimes, but a lot of times just care for one another.
Yeah,
but I think for me, after 32 years, my wife and I are discovering that I don't listen to her very well. I'm a therapist. I listen to people. I'm a trained therapist. I train counselors. And my wife has been making it really painfully clear to me, I'm not listening to her well. She can see the defensiveness, or where I'm already presuming I know what she's about to say. And so for me, I've had a period of about 6 months now where I'm having to sit back and go, what am I not getting? Like almost within any conversation, what am I not seeing? What am I not getting? Yeah. Where am I really thinking we're doing well, but we're not? That's a very humbling thing. So I think the context of normalcy, but this period is choosing a kind of humility that is not natural to me, has opened up new doors.
You talk a lot about submission and the role of submission in marriage and relationships, and that's a controversial term. First of all, what does submissiveness look like for both genders, and then we'll get into each role.
Well, the first thing I would say is that submission is thinking of the other person ahead of yourself, putting their agenda ahead of yours. And I think people often misread Ephesians to say that the burden of submission is just for women. And they don't look at the immediately preceding verse, which talks about Christians submitting to each other. And so, so I feel most comfortable talking about mutual submission. And it makes a lot of sense to me that a relationship will work when both people are looking out for the interests of the other person. If there's only one person, if the woman's only supposed to look out for my interests, if Alice is only supposed to look out for my interests, then we kind of devolve into the kind of headship that we were saying earlier is a problem, that the man is the most important thing in the marriage. But mutual submission, which none of us do perfectly, obviously, because we're all basically selfish people looking out for our own agendas, but mutual submission is something that can lead to beautiful relational harmony.
Well, for a wedding, my wife and I took the 1999 Arthur Murray dance course. And at one point, the instructor was saying to me, she can't follow if you don't lead. So, do something. And she can respond to your doing something, even if it's stepping on her. She can do something. And as I began to lead, my wife is a far better dancer. Her beauty, in one sense, began to lead us. So that interplay is, again, a kind of beauty that you just don't find unless both of us are engaging submitted-oriented heart to one another. Yeah. So if it's, I'm looking to you, it doesn't mean that I'm not also aware of my own pleasure. But if it's, I'm committed to her pleasure, she's committed to mine, we're committed to ours, then that's what mutual submission means.